It was a chilly autumn evening in downtown Chicago. The city's skyline was a masterpiece, its lights twinkling like stars against the inky night. Emma, a young journalist, had just finished a long day at work and decided to treat herself to a nice dinner. As she stood on the street corner, her breath visible in the cold air, she pulled out her phone and ordered an Uber. The driver, Greg, arrived promptly. His profile picture showed a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a friendly smile. As Emma climbed into the back seat, she noticed the car was immaculate, a stark contrast to the cold, bustling streets outside. The soft hum of the engine and the warmth inside made her feel at ease. "Good evening," Greg said, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. His voice was calm, almost soothing. "Evening," Emma replied, smiling back. She settled into her seat, her mind drifting to the warm meal she was about to enjoy. The ride started uneventfully, with Greg making polite small talk. But as they drove deeper into the city, the conversation took a strange turn. Greg began sharing stories of his life, all seemingly ordinary at first. However, Emma soon noticed an unsettling theme. Each story involved a passenger who never reached their destination. "There was this one guy," Greg began, his voice dropping to a whisper. "He was quiet, didn't say much, but halfway through the ride he just vanished. Left his bag, his coat, everything." Emma felt a chill run down her spine. "Vanished?" she repeated, her voice tinged with disbelief. Greg nodded, his eyes locking with hers in the mirror. "Just like that. Never heard from him again." Emma tried to laugh it off, attributing the unease to Greg's storytelling, but something about his tone and the way he emphasized certain words made her skin crawl. She glanced out the window, noticing they were taking an unfamiliar route. Greg, is this the fastest way to the restaurant?" she asked, her voice shaky. Greg's gaze met hers again, his eyes devoid of the warmth they initially held. "Just taking a shortcut," he replied, his lips curling into a strange smile. As they drove on, the city lights began to fade, replaced by dark, empty streets. Emma's heart raced, her mind flashing through countless horror stories she'd heard over the years. She reached for her phone, but before she could check the map, the car came to an abrupt stop. "We're here," Greg announced, his voice eerily calm. Emma looked around, confusion and fear battling for dominance in her mind. They were in an industrial area, far from any restaurant. Her instincts screamed at her to get out, but her body felt frozen, paralyzed by the growing sense of dread. Before she could react, Greg turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Sometimes people get lost," he said softly, his words hanging in the air like a dark cloud. Emma's breath quickened as she fumbled with the door handle, her fingers trembling. Finally, the door gave way, and she stumbled out, her eyes wide with fear. As she ran down the street, she glanced back to see Greg's car slowly disappearing into the darkness. Months later, Emma found herself in another Uber, this time in New York City. The hustle and bustle of the city had a way of making her feel anonymous, lost in the crowd. After the incident with Greg, she'd become more cautious, but life had to go on. Her driver this time was an older man named Tom, with graying hair and a soft-spoken demeanor. The car was filled with the faint scent of lavender, creating a calming atmosphere. Emma settled in, trying to shake off the lingering paranoia from her last experience. The ride started smoothly, with Tom engaging in light conversation about the weather and city life. But soon, the conversation shifted as Tom mentioned an unusual experience he had had a few weeks prior. "It was late, around midnight," Tom began, his voice carrying a hint of unease. "I picked up a woman from the airport. She seemed normal, polite even, but there was something off about her." Emma listened intently, her curiosity piqued despite herself. "She didn't speak much," Tom continued, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "But halfway through the ride, I noticed she was crying silently. I asked if she was okay, but she just shook her head and whispered, 'He won't leave me alone.'" A shiver ran down Emma's spine. Did she explain what she meant? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom shook his head. No, she just kept whispering the same phrase, over and over. When we reached her destination, she got out and walked into the building without looking back. Emma felt a growing unease. What happened next? Tom hesitated, his fingers tightening on the steering wheel. I was curious, so I looked back at my dashcam footage. There was no one in the back seat. Emma's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? Tom's face was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. The footage showed me talking to myself the entire time, no passenger, just me. Emma's work brought her to San Francisco next, a city known for its foggy nights and steep hills. The eerie stories she'd heard and experienced made her wary, but she continued using rideshares, albeit with caution. One evening, after a particularly long day, she ordered an Uber to take her back to her hotel. The driver, a young woman named Lisa, greeted her with a warm smile. The car was cozy, filled with soft music and the faint scent of vanilla. They chatted casually, Lisa sharing stories of her life in San Francisco. As they drove through the fog-laden streets, the conversation turned to strange experiences Lisa had encountered as a driver. Last week, Lisa began, her voice tinged with unease. I picked up a man from a bar downtown. He seemed normal, a little drunk, but nothing unusual. Emma nodded, listening closely. We drove for a while, and he was talking about his life, his family. But when I glanced at the rearview mirror, I saw him staring at me with this blank expression. It was like he wasn't really there. A chill ran through Emma. What did you do? Lisa sighed, her fingers tapping nervously on the steering wheel. I tried to engage him in conversation, but he just kept staring. When we arrived at his destination, he got out without saying a word and disappeared into the fog. Emma frowned. Did you check your dash cam? Lisa nodded. Yeah, and this is where it gets weird. The footage showed him sitting in the back, but his face, it was blurry, like it wasn't fully there. And the timestamps? They were all wrong, showing times that hadn't happened yet. Emma felt a cold sweat forming on her forehead. Did you ever see him again? Lisa shook her head. No. I even went back to the bar to see if anyone knew him, but they all claimed they'd never seen him before. Emma's travels eventually took her to New Orleans, a city known for its rich history and vibrant culture. But beneath the surface, the city held a darker, more mysterious aura, one that Emma felt acutely as she walked through its narrow streets. One night, after exploring the French Quarter, she ordered an Uber to return to her hotel. The driver, a middle-aged man named Paul, had a heavy New Orleans accent and a jovial demeanor. The car was decorated with beads and voodoo dolls, adding to the city's mystique. As they drove through the winding streets, Paul began sharing stories of the city's haunted history. Emma, though intrigued, couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, a sensation that had followed her since she arrived. Paul's stories grew darker, more personal. He spoke of picking up passengers who seemed lost in time, their clothes and mannerisms from another era. He recounted a particularly eerie experience from a few months prior. I picked up this woman near the old cemetery, Paul said, his voice lowering to a whisper. She was dressed in a long, old-fashioned gown, like something from the 1800s. She asked to be taken to a place that didn't exist anymore. Emma's pulse quickened. What happened then? Paul's face was pale, his eyes reflecting the city's haunting glow. I told her I didn't know the place, but she insisted, her voice desperate. So, I drove to where she directed, even though I knew it was just an empty lot. Emma leaned forward, her eyes wide with anticipation. When we arrived, she smiled, thanked me, and got out of the car. I watched as she walked into the darkness. And then, she vanished. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Vanished? Paul nodded, his hands trembling on the wheel. Just like that. I checked the dashcam footage later and it was the same story. No sign of her. The footage showed me driving alone. Emma's experiences left her shaken, each ride embedding a deep-seated fear and curiosity. She began researching similar stories, uncovering countless accounts of strange Uber rides, passengers who vanished, and drivers who encountered the unexplainable. One night, while poring over her notes, she received a call. It was from an unknown number, but she answered, driven by an insatiable curiosity. "Hello, Emma," a voice whispered, sending chills down her spine. It was Greg, her first unsettling driver. "Still writing about us, I see." Emma's heart raced, her mind scrambling for an explanation. "Who are you? What do you want?" The voice on the other end chuckled, a cold, eerie sound that sent shivers down her spine. "We are the unseen passengers, the forgotten souls. We travel through the shadows, unnoticed, yet always present." Emma felt a cold sweat forming on her skin. "What do you mean?" The line went dead, leaving Emma in a silence more terrifying than any noise. She sat there, her mind racing with possibilities, each more chilling than the last. As she stared at her phone, a notification popped up. It was a ride request from a user named The Unseen. The pickup location was her own address. Emma's blood ran cold. She quickly locked her door and turned off the lights, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she wouldn't be able to sleep that night, haunted by the knowledge that some stories once started could never be truly ended. And so, she continued her research, delving deeper into the shadows, always looking over her shoulder, wondering if she would become the next story in her collection of unsettling Uber experiences.